The night express, where one seat was never taken. Warm. Every train has a rhythm, a quiet pattern of arrivals and departures, of seats filling and emptying, of strangers briefly sharing a moving space before drifting apart again. We trust this rhythm because it repeats, because it has rules, because it rarely surprises us. But on certain night journeys, repetition becomes a disguise. The night express followed its route precisely. Its timetable was flawless. Its carriages were inspected. Its seats were numbered and counted. And yet, from the moment the train left the platform, one seat remained empty. Not because no one wanted it, not because it was broken, not because the train was full. The seat simply refused to be taken. Passengers noticed it in passing, only briefly, only casually, a glance while stowing a bag, a hesitation before choosing another place, the faint, inexplicable sense that the seat did not belong to this journey. No announcement was made, no warning given. Nothing suggested that choosing a different seat mattered at all. Until, somewhere between stations, the crew realized something quietly unsettling. That seat had been empty since departure, and no one could remember why. Because sometimes the most disturbing mysteries are not about what disappears, but about what never arrives in the first place. The seat that drew no one. The night express departed on time. Its engine hummed with quiet confidence as it pulled away from the platform, lights sliding past windows in smooth, golden lines. There was nothing unusual about the departure, no last-minute rush, no shouted announcements, no delays to explain away later. The train did exactly what it was designed to do. It left. Inside the carriages, passengers settled into the familiar choreography of night travel. Bags were lifted into overhead racks. Coats were folded, then unfolded again as the temperature inside adjusted. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else switched off a reading light with a soft click. The train found its rhythm quickly. In the third carriage, most of the seats filled within minutes of departure. People chose places instinctively, near windows, near aisles, close to exits, far from them. These choices were made without thought, guided by habit more than logic. Yet one seat remained empty. It was not hidden. It was not damaged. It sat in the middle row, clearly numbered, identical to every other seat around it. Passengers noticed it only in fragments. A woman walking down the aisle paused briefly, glancing at the number, then moved on. A man stood with his bag in hand, hesitated, and chose a seat 2 rows back instead. Another passenger glanced toward it, frowned without understanding why, and continued down the carriage. No one discussed it. There was no reason to. Empty seats were common at night. The train was busy, but not full. There was nothing unusual about choosing one place over another. And yet, seat 17B remained, untouched. The conductor entered the carriage shortly after departure, moving with practiced efficiency. His eyes swept across the rows, not counting yet, just observing. Faces, luggage, posture. The quiet inventory of experience. He did not stop at the empty seat, at least not consciously. He moved on, checking tickets further down the carriage, unaware that his gaze had slid past something it would later struggle to account for. Time passed. The train pressed into open countryside, the darkness outside deepening as towns gave way to unlit fields. The steady motion of the carriage softened attention, encouraging thought to wander. Passengers sank into the peculiar calm that came only with night journeys, half alert, half distant. Seat 17B remained empty. A woman across the aisle finally sat down, glancing toward it once more as she did. She had intended to sit there, she was almost certain of it. But something had stopped her. She could not say what. She opened her book and began to read, the thought slipping away as easily as it had arrived. The seat did not draw attention to itself. It did not feel ominous or threatening. It did not radiate discomfort. It simply existed, quietly unchosen, as though it were waiting for a decision that never came. A man nearby stood to stretch his legs. He stepped into the aisle, glanced down at the seat, then turned away again. Later, he would struggle to explain why. "I just didn't think about it," he would say. The conductor returned to the third carriage to begin the formal ticket check. "Tickets, please." Hands moved, papers were produced, wallets opened and closed. The familiar ritual unfolded smoothly. The conductor progressed down the aisle, marking off seat numbers as he went. When he reached the row containing seat 17B, he paused. Only briefly, a second, perhaps less. He glanced down at his list, then back at the row. The seats on either side were occupied. The passengers seated there looked up, expecting him to collect a ticket from the space between them. He did not. Instead, he nodded once, more to himself than to anyone else, and continued on. The pause registered nowhere else. Not yet. The train continued its journey. Outside, the darkness grew thicker, broken only by the occasional distant light. Inside, the carriage settled into stillness. Some passengers slept. Others stared into the blackness beyond the windows, their reflections faint and overlapping. Seat 17B remained empty. At some point, no one could later say exactly when, the idea that it might be filled ceased to exist. Passengers no longer considered it. Their eyes moved past it without registering the gap. The seat blended into the pattern of the carriage, its emptiness no longer notable. This was not a conscious act. It was a quiet agreement formed without discussion. The conductor finished his checks and moved on to the next carriage. Minutes passed, then more. The night express moved steadily onward, sealed and uninterrupted. Only later, much later, would anyone attempt to reconstruct the beginning of the mystery. To identify the moment when the seat had first gone unnoticed. To understand how an ordinary, empty space had slipped beyond attention without resistance. For now, the journey remained calm, orderly, uneventful. Seat 17B sat quietly between two occupied places, indistinguishable from them in every measurable way except for one. No one remembered choosing not to sit there, and no one, yet, had asked why. The train carried on through the night, unaware or unconcerned that it had already begun to collect something intangible. Not a person, not an object, but a question. One that had formed the moment a seat remained empty, and no one thought to claim it. When absence goes uncounted. The first indication that something was wrong did not arrive as a realization. It arrived as a discrepancy. The conductor returned to the third carriage sometime after midnight, his steps steady, his posture relaxed. This was the portion of the route where nothing ever changed. Passengers had settled. Tickets had been checked once already. The train moved through long stretches of countryside where interruptions were rare and unexpected. Routine ruled this hour. He paused at the entrance to the carriage and let his eyes travel down the aisle. Not deliberately, not analytically, simply the habitual scan of someone who had done this for years. That was when the sense of imbalance first surfaced. It was faint, almost dismissible. A subtle awareness that something did not align the way it should. The conductor could not have explained it in words, only in feeling. Too quiet, perhaps. Too orderly. Too even. He stepped inside and walked slowly down the aisle, glancing left and right. Seats were occupied. Passengers slept or stared ahead. Bags were stored correctly. Everything appeared normal, and yet... When he reached the middle row, his steps slowed. Seat 17B was empty. The conductor frowned, not in concern, but in mild confusion. Empty seats were not unusual, but this one struck him differently, though he could not immediately say why. He checked the seat number again, 17B. He consulted his list. There should have been a passenger assigned there. He flipped the page, then flipped it back, scanning names and numbers with quiet concentration. The entry was there, clear, unambiguous. Seat 17B, assigned. He looked up. The seat remained empty. For a moment, the conductor simply stood there, holding the list in one hand, the other resting lightly against the back of the adjacent seat. The passengers on either side of the empty space glanced up at him expectantly. He did not ask them for tickets. He hesitated. "Excuse me," he said finally, addressing the woman seated across the aisle. "Was someone sitting here earlier?" She looked at the seat, then back at him. I don't think so," she said, then hesitated. "Or maybe they were? I'm not sure." The uncertainty surprised her. The conductor nodded slowly. He turned to the man seated beside the empty space. "Did anyone sit here when you boarded?" The man frowned, thinking. "I don't recall anyone sitting there." "Not at all?" the conductor pressed gently. "No," the man said, with more confidence than the woman had shown. "It was empty when I came in." The conductor thanked them and stepped back. He checked the surrounding rows. Other passengers confirmed the same thing. They did not remember anyone sitting in seat 17B. And yet, the list insisted otherwise. The conductor felt a subtle unease begin to form, not sharp enough to alarm, but persistent enough to resist dismissal. He moved on, checking the rest of the carriage. Everything else aligned perfectly. Every other seat matched its assignment. Every other passenger accounted for. Only seat 17B resisted explanation. He returned to it once more. The seat cushion showed no clear indentation. The fabric lay smooth and unwrinkled. There was no bag beneath it, no jacket draped across the armrest. Nothing to suggest recent use. And yet, the record insisted someone should have been there. The conductor made a small mark beside the entry in his list. He did not alert the driver. He did not inform central operations. There was, as yet, no justification for escalation. Instead, he continued his routine, finishing the carriage and moving on. But the thought followed him. Later, perhaps 15 minutes later, perhaps more, he returned again. Seat 17B was still empty. This time, he noticed something else. Passengers were avoiding it. not deliberately, not consciously. Their eyes passed over it without pausing, their bodies angled away from it slightly when they shifted in their seats. When someone stood to stretch their legs, they stepped around it as though it were already occupied. The conductor watched this quietly, unease deepening. He approached a woman who had just walked past the seat. "Why didn't you sit there?" he asked, keeping his tone light. She blinked, surprised by the question. "I didn't think about it." "But you were looking for a seat." "Yes." "And you saw this one?" She hesitated. "I suppose I did." "But you didn't choose it." "No," she said slowly. "I didn't." Neither of them could explain why. The conductor stepped back and looked at the seat again. There was nothing about it that marked it as undesirable. It was not near the door, not beside the restroom, not cramped or isolated. It was, by every measurable standard, ordinary. And yet no one claimed it. The conductor felt the first true stirrings of concern then, not because something had gone missing, but because something had been bypassed, an absence that no one questioned. He returned to his list and read the entry again, Seat 17B, assigned. But to whom? The name beside it blurred slightly in his mind. He could see the letters, but they failed to resolve into something solid. He closed the notebook. The train continued its steady passage through the night, wheels humming softly beneath the carriage. Inside, seat 17B remained empty, not as an anomaly, not as a disruption, but as a quiet constant, an unclaimed space that resisted attention so effectively that its emptiness began to feel natural. And as the conductor moved away once more, a troubling thought settled into his awareness. If a seat could remain empty without being noticed, then perhaps absence did not require loss. Perhaps it required only that no one remember expecting something to be there at all. The name that would not stay. The conductor tried to remember the name. It seemed a simple enough task. Names were the backbone of his work. Lists, reservations, confirmations. He handled dozens each night, often without effort. They stayed where they belonged, neatly attached to numbers and seats and destinations. Seat 17B should have been no different. And yet, when he opened his notebook again, the name beside it refused to settle in his mind. He could see the ink, the shape of the letters. He knew there was a name there. But when he tried to hold it, to say it silently, to repeat it to himself, it slipped away, leaving behind only the sense that it had almost been recalled. He frowned and closed the book. Fatigue, he told himself. Late hours did strange things to attention. The mind reached for familiar explanations when something felt wrong, and fatigue was always close at hand. Still, the discomfort remained. The conductor slowed his pace as he moved between carriages, aware now that the unease followed him wherever he went. It was no longer confined to seat 17B. It had become part of the journey itself. When he returned to the third carriage, he stopped just inside the doorway and watched. Passengers sat quietly. Some slept. Others stared out into the darkness beyond the windows, their reflections faintly visible, layered over the passing night. The carriage felt calm, almost too calm. Seat 17B remained empty, not conspicuously so, just consistently. The conductor walked down the aisle again, slower this time, letting his eyes linger where they normally would not. He watched how people moved, how their attention flowed. No one looked at the seat directly. They looked around it, past it, through it. A man stood to retrieve something from the overhead rack. He stepped into the aisle, glanced briefly toward seat 17B, then shifted his weight and took a half step away from it without realizing he had done so. The conductor noticed. A woman adjusted her bag, pulling it closer to her feet. When she did, she angled it away from the empty space beside her, as though accommodating an unseen presence, or avoiding one. The conductor approached her gently. "May I ask you something?" She looked up, startled. "Of course." "Do you remember who was meant to sit here?" He gestured toward the empty seat. She followed his hand, eye settling on 17B. For a moment, her brow furrowed. "I don't," she said slowly. "I know you said someone was assigned here, but—" She stopped, searching for words. "But it feels like it was always empty," she finished, uncertain. The conductor nodded and stepped back. That was the first time anyone had said it aloud. Always empty. The phrase stayed with him as he continued down the carriage. He stopped beside another passenger, a man who had boarded early and had barely moved since departure. "Sir," the conductor said softly, "do you recall seeing anyone sit in seat 17B when you boarded?" The man frowned, genuinely trying. "No," he said after a moment. "I remember choosing my seat. I remember thinking there were plenty of options." "Do you remember passing that seat?" The man hesitated. "I don't remember it at all." That answer was more troubling than a contradiction would have been. The conductor thanked him and moved on. He returned once more to his notebook and opened it carefully, as though sudden movement might cause something to escape. Seat 17B. The name was still there, but now, when he looked at it, the letters seemed oddly unfamiliar. Correct in form, wrong in substance, like a word from a language he almost knew. He tried to sound it out silently. Nothing. He closed the notebook again. As the train continued through the night, the sense of dislocation deepened. The darkness outside felt thicker now, more complete, as though the train were moving through a space without reference points. Inside, time softened. Minutes passed without clear edges. The carriage lights hummed quietly, unchanging. The motion of the train became hypnotic, encouraging thought to drift and return in uneven cycles. The conductor leaned briefly against the wall near the door, steadying himself. He considered contacting Central Operations again. He considered waking the driver, explaining the discrepancy. But how would he phrase it? A seat assigned to a passenger who had never arrived? A name that refused to stay remembered? An absence no one recalled becoming an absence. There was nothing concrete to report. No disruption, no missing person, no event. Only a space that resisted being filled. When the conductor returned to the third carriage yet again, something subtle had changed. The passengers were quieter, not asleep, not tense, but attentive in a way that suggested awareness without understanding. They seemed to be waiting for something, though none of them could have said what. Seat 17B remained empty. The conductor stood beside it and spoke, quietly but clearly. This seat is assigned. The words hung in the air. No one reacted. He tried again. Someone was meant to be here. A few passengers looked up, then away again. The statement seemed to slide past them without purchase. The conductor felt a chill, not of fear, but of recognition. The problem was no longer that the seat was empty. The problem was that the expectation of occupancy was failing to hold. He lowered his voice. "Does anyone remember expecting someone to sit here?" Silence answered him. The train continued on, its motion steady and indifferent. The conductor stepped away, heart heavy with a realization he did not yet fully understand. Whatever was happening was not removing something that had been present. It was removing the idea that something should have been there at all. And if expectation could be erased so cleanly, then absence no longer needed an explanation. It could simply become the new normal. Seat 17B remained empty as the night express carried its passengers deeper into the darkness. And with every mile that passed, the name beside that seat grew lighter, less attached to reality, until it existed only as ink on a page that no longer remembered why it had been written. The space that began to spread. The longer seat 17B remained empty, the less it felt like a single omission. It began to feel expansive. Not physically, its dimensions did not change, nor did the space around it visibly widen. The carriage remained structurally identical to every other, and yet something about the empty seat seemed to exert a quiet influence on the space surrounding it, as though absence itself were capable of reaching outward. Passengers sensed it without understanding it. They adjusted their posture unconsciously, angling shoulders away from the center row. Conversations, already minimal, grew shorter, then ceased altogether. Even the small sounds of travel softened, as though the carriage had collectively agreed to lower its volume. The conductor noticed this immediately. He returned to the third carriage with a new attentiveness, no longer performing routine checks but observing patterns. How people chose to move, where their eyes lingered, what they avoided. Seat 17B had become a reference point. Passengers did not look at it directly, but their movements oriented themselves around it. When someone stood to retrieve luggage, they stepped around the empty seat with unnecessary care. When a woman crossed the aisle, she chose a longer path rather than passing directly beside it. The conductor stopped beside the seat again. Nothing about it had changed. The fabric was smooth, the armrests aligned. The seat number remained clear and legible. And yet the air around it felt subtly unsettled, as though the space had not finished deciding what it was meant to contain. The conductor addressed the carriage gently. "This seat is available," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "If anyone would like to move, you're welcome to." No one responded. No one even shifted. The words had landed, but failed to attach themselves to action. A man near the aisle cleared his throat. "I'm fine where I am," he said quietly. Others nodded, murmuring agreement. The conductor watched carefully. None of them appeared uncomfortable in their own seats. There was no obvious reason not to move, except the unspoken one. He stepped away and continued his slow walk down the carriage. As he moved, he felt the same sensation he had experienced earlier, a sense that the carriage itself had changed shape, not in form, but in function. It no longer felt like a neutral container. It felt selective. The thought unsettled him. Trains did not choose. Seats did not choose. And yet, seat 17B remained untouched, not because it repelled people, but because it failed to register as an option. Later, as the train moved through a particularly long stretch of darkness, something else began to happen. Passengers stopped referencing time. Normally, night travelers checked watches, phones, schedules, small anchors that reminded them of progress. Now, no one did. The rhythm of the train seemed sufficient, its steady motion replacing the need for measurement. The conductor glanced at his own watch. He had been in this carriage longer than he realized. He frowned, unsure when he had last checked the time. The sensation passed quickly, but it left behind a residue of unease. He looked again at seat 17B. For a brief moment, so brief he almost dismissed it, the seat seemed indistinct. Not blurred exactly, but harder to define at its edges, as though his focus slid across it rather than settling on it. He blinked. The seat was normal again. Still, the experience stayed with him. He approached a woman seated nearby, lowering his voice. "May I ask you something?" She nodded. "Do you feel uncomfortable sitting here?" She considered the question. "No," she said honestly. "Just alert." "About what?" She hesitated. "I'm not sure." The conductor thanked her and moved on. Alert. Not afraid, not uneasy. Alert without cause, as if the carriage were gently insisting on attention. The train surged onward, its motion unwavering. Outside, the darkness pressed close, uninterrupted by stations or signals. Inside, the passengers sat in a kind of suspended awareness, neither relaxed nor alarmed. Seat 17B remained empty. And now, something else had changed. The conductor realized that even he had stopped expecting it to be filled. The thought startled him. He prided himself on order, on accountability. And yet, somewhere between one pass through the carriage and the next, the expectation that someone should occupy that seat had quietly dissolved. The list in his pocket still said otherwise, but the lived reality of the carriage contradicted it so completely that the list felt theoretical. He removed the notebook again and opened it. The name beside seat 17B was still there, but now it looked wrong in a different way, less faded, more intrusive, as though it no longer belonged. He traced the letters lightly with his finger. The name did not resolve into meaning. It was no longer attached to a person, only to the idea that there had once been an expectation. He closed the notebook decisively. The conductor stood still for a moment, steadying himself. This was no longer about a missing passenger. It was about the way absence could spread when left unchallenged, how a single, empty space could reshape awareness, subtly but persistently. The carriage felt quieter now, heavier with unspoken understanding. Passengers were no longer simply avoiding the seat, they were accommodating it, making room for it, allowing it to exist as part of the journey. The conductor realized, with a slow, sinking certainty, that the longer seat 17B remained empty, the harder it would be to imagine it ever being otherwise. Absence, once accepted, did not remain contained. It expanded, it softened expectations. It rewrote normal. The night express continued its steady progress through the night, carrying its passengers toward destinations that still existed, still mattered. But inside the third carriage, something intangible had begun to take hold. Space that did not demand explanation. A seat that did not need a reason. An absence that no longer felt temporary. And as the train pressed onward, the conductor understood that whatever this was, it was no longer confined to seat 17B. It was beginning to shape the journey itself. The station that could not see it. The night express began to slow without announcement. There was no sudden jolt, no screech of brakes, only a gradual change in rhythm, the familiar deceleration that signaled an approaching station. Outside the windows, the darkness thinned as distant lights gathered themselves into lines and shapes. Platforms emerged, orderly and illuminated, waiting with the quiet confidence of places that believed they understood what passed through them. Inside the third carriage, the shift in motion drew passengers gently back to attention. Bags were adjusted, coats were straightened. A few people glanced at their watches again, reassured by numbers returning to relevance. Arrival, after all, restored structure. It divided journeys into before and after. The conductor entered the carriage ahead of the stop, his expression composed, his posture purposeful. "We'll be arriving shortly," he said calmly. "Please remain seated when we do." No one questioned the instruction. The train eased into the station and came to rest beneath bright, even lights. The stillness that followed felt heavier than usual, as though the carriage were reluctant to release its occupants back into the world beyond its walls. The doors opened. Cool air entered, carrying the scent of metal, concrete, and distant rain. Footsteps echoed faintly from the platform outside. Voices, indistinct and ordinary, floated in from somewhere beyond the carriage. Two uniformed station officials boarded with the conductor. They moved with quiet efficiency, the practiced confidence of people accustomed to resolving discrepancies. "Good evening," one of them said. "We've been asked to conduct a brief check." The passengers watched silently as the officials began their work. Tickets were examined, seat numbers confirmed, names compared against lists. Everything aligned, until they reached seat 17B. The official paused, consulting his clipboard. "This seat is unoccupied," he observed. "Yes," the conductor replied. "It has been since departure." The official glanced up, surprised. "No one boarded later?" "No." "No one moved?" "No." The official nodded slowly and stepped closer to the seat. He examined it carefully, as though expecting to find some mark of distinction, damage, obstruction, anything that might explain why it had been bypassed. There was nothing. "Has anyone attempted to sit here?" he asked the carriage. The question landed softly. Passengers exchanged glances. A woman opened her mouth, then closed it again. "I don't think so," someone said finally. Another voice added, "I didn't notice it." The official made a note. He continued his inspection, checking beneath the seat, the luggage rack above it, the surrounding aisle. He stood back and considered the row as a whole. "This seat is available," he said matter-of-factly. "There's no restriction on it." No one moved. The official waited. Still, no one moved. The pause stretched uncomfortably. The conductor felt a subtle tightening in his chest, not fear, but recognition. This was the moment when external authority should have reasserted order, when the presence of uniforms and procedure should have restored normal behavior. It had not. The official glanced at the conductor. "Is there a missing passenger?" The conductor hesitated. "There is a record indicating someone should have been seated here." "But no one recalls boarding?" "No." "No one recalls expecting someone?" "No." The official frowned. "Then what's the issue?" The question was reasonable and impossible to answer. "There's no violation," the official continued. "No disruption, no safety concern." He closed his clipboard. "From our standpoint, everything is in order." The words echoed strangely. In order. The officials disembarked. The doors closed. The whistle sounded. And just like that, the station released the train back into motion. As the night express pulled away, the bright certainty of the platform lights receded, replaced once more by darkness. The world outside resumed its indifference, offering no explanation for what had just passed unnoticed. Inside the carriage, something shifted. The inspection had not resolved the issue. It had legitimized it. By acknowledging seat 17B as ordinary, available, and unremarkable, the station had stripped away the last expectation that it required explanation. The conductor returned to his position at the front of the carriage, his expression unreadable. Passengers sat quietly, absorbing what had happened. The station had seen everything that mattered to it. Tickets, names, numbers, safety. It had not seen the absence, or rather, it had seen it and found nothing wrong. The realization settled slowly, like a weight. If a system designed to account for people could overlook a space that no one would occupy, then perhaps the problem was not the seat. Perhaps it was the limits of observation. A woman near the window leaned toward the man beside her. "I thought the station would explain it," she whispered. "So did I," he replied. The train surged onward, its motion steady, its course unchanged. Seat 17B remained empty, not because it was forbidden, not because it was dangerous, but because somewhere along the journey it had slipped beyond the category of things that demanded attention. The conductor glanced back one last time at the row. For the first time he understood the deeper implication. The station, solid, official, unquestionable, had failed to see what was missing. And if absence could pass through such a place unnoticed, then there was no guarantee it would ever be reclaimed. The night express continued into the darkness, carrying its passengers onward. Behind them, the station lights faded. Ahead of them, the journey stretched on, intact, orderly, and quietly altered by a space that no longer needed to justify its emptiness. Seat 17B had passed inspection, and in doing so, it had become something far more difficult to address than a missing passenger. It had become invisible. After the station. Let it pass. Once the station disappeared behind them, the carriage seemed to settle into a different state of motion. The night express continued forward at the same speed, along the same track, under the same rules. Nothing about its behavior suggested disruption. And yet, to those inside the third carriage, the journey felt subtly altered, as though it were now carrying something that could not be weighed or recorded. Not a passenger, an allowance. The conductor stood near the front of the carriage for a long moment after departure. listening to the steady hum beneath his feet. The inspection should have closed the matter. Stations existed to interrupt journeys when something fell outside expectation. They restored order by acknowledging irregularities and resolving them. This station had done neither. It had looked directly at seat 17B and found nothing wrong. That disturbed him more than if it had found a fault. He walked slowly down the aisle again, not checking tickets this time, not observing behavior. He was watching for something else, something he could not yet define. Passengers sat quietly, many of them aware that the station had changed nothing. Some leaned back with folded arms. Others stared out the windows, eyes unfocused, as though the darkness outside offered fewer questions than the space inside the carriage. Seat 17B remained empty. But now it felt established. Before the stop, its emptiness had carried tension. After the station, that tension had drained away, replaced by something heavier and more permanent. The seat no longer felt like a temporary anomaly. It felt confirmed. The conductor paused beside it again. No one looked up. He realized then that the seat had ceased to attract attention altogether, not because it had become invisible, but because it had been accepted. Its emptiness no longer suggested error. It suggested design. That thought made him uneasy. Trains were not designed with unused spaces. A man near the window shifted and checked his phone, then frowned slightly. "That's strange," he murmured. "What is?" the woman beside him asked. "I thought we'd been moving longer than this," he said. "But the time doesn't match." She checked her own phone. "Mine's the same." They exchanged a glance, then let the matter drop. The conductor noticed the exchange. It was small, inconsequential, and yet it echoed the same pattern. Expectation misaligned with observation. The conductor checked his watch again. He was certain more time had passed than the display suggested. The sensation faded quickly, but it left behind a faint unease. He moved on. Passengers had grown quieter, not withdrawn, but inward. Conversations no longer started. Movements were minimal and deliberate. Even the natural restlessness of long travel seemed subdued, as though the carriage were discouraging unnecessary motion. Seat 17B remained untouched. A woman stood to stretch her legs. She stepped into the aisle, then stopped briefly beside the empty seat. For a moment the conductor thought she might sit. She did not. She hesitated, glanced at the seat number, then continued walking, her expression faintly puzzled. The conductor approached her gently. "Was something wrong with that seat?" he asked. She looked surprised. "No." "Then why didn't you sit there?" She searched for an answer and found none. "I don't know," she said honestly. "It just didn't feel like an option." The conductor nodded and stepped away. That was the third time he had heard the same phrasing. Not uncomfortable, not forbidden, not avoided, simply not an option. The conductor returned to his notebook and opened it again. Seat 17B stared back at him from the page, its assignment intact. The name beside it no longer resisted memory in the same way. Now it felt irrelevant. He could see the letters clearly, but they no longer suggested a person. They felt archival, residue rather than reference. He closed the notebook. The train continued through a long stretch of unlit countryside. Outside, the darkness was complete, uninterrupted by towns or signals. Inside, the carriage felt insulated from the world beyond its walls, sealed not just by doors and windows, but by shared understanding. Whatever seat 17B represented, it belonged to this journey now. The conductor leaned lightly against a seatback, his thoughts circling a realization he had been avoiding. Absence had not been introduced by loss. It had been introduced by permission. The station had granted it legitimacy. The system had acknowledged the empty seat and moved on. And in doing so, it had taught everyone inside the carriage that this absence did not require resolution. That lesson was powerful and dangerous. A man in the back of the carriage spoke quietly, not addressing anyone in particular. "Do you think it's always been empty?" The words were soft, almost casual, but the question struck deeply. Several passengers glanced toward seat 17B. No one answered, because the question itself suggested something unsettling, that memory had adjusted retroactively, that expectation had rewritten itself to accommodate what now seemed normal. The conductor felt a tightening in his chest. If that were true, if the mind could revise expectations so completely, then absence did not need to announce itself. It could arrive quietly, settle in, and be accepted as though it had always belonged. The train moved onward, its motion smooth and uninterrupted. Seat 17B remained empty. And now, something else was missing too. The sense that this emptiness needed explanation. Passengers no longer waited for answers. They no longer anticipated correction. The journey had absorbed the anomaly and continued, unchanged in form, but altered in meaning. The conductor looked down the aisle one last time. Every passenger was present, every seat accounted for, everything in order. And yet, the carriage felt incomplete in a way that no checklist could capture. The absence had stopped being noticed. It had stopped being questioned. It had stopped being temporary. The night express carried on through the night, steady and precise, toward destinations that still existed and still mattered. But inside the third carriage, something fundamental had shifted. Not because something was missing, but because nothing insisted it should be found. The agreement no one remembered making. The change did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, as most agreements do, not through discussion or consent, but through repetition, through the slow alignment of behavior until deviation felt unnecessary. By the time the night express reached the long, uninterrupted stretch between major stations, the third carriage had settled into a new equilibrium. Seat 17B remained empty, and no one expected it to be otherwise. The conductor noticed this with a mixture of unease and reluctant admiration. Systems, after all, were designed to adapt. They absorbed irregularities, normalized them, and moved on. That adaptability was what kept them functional. But this felt different. He stood at the front of the carriage and watched the passengers, not as individuals now, but as a collective. Their movements were minimal, their posture attentive without tension. It was as though they had all adjusted to accommodate something unsaid. No one spoke about the seat. No one glanced at it for long. No one challenged its emptiness. The agreement had formed fully. A woman seated near the aisle shifted and crossed her legs, then uncrossed them again. She glanced briefly toward seat 17B, not with curiosity, but with the same disinterest one might show a wall or a window, something present, fixed, and irrelevant. She returned to her thoughts without pause. The conductor felt a chill. It was not that the seat was being avoided, it was that it had been categorized, filed away as something that did not require interaction. He walked down the aisle slowly, stopping beside the empty seat once more. He did not announce himself. He did not gesture. He simply stood there, waiting to see if his presence would disrupt the pattern. It did not. Passengers did not look up. The seat did not draw attention. The conductor cleared his throat softly. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. A man nearby glanced up. "Yes?" The conductor gestured toward the seat. "Is there any reason you haven't moved?" The man followed his hand, eyes settling on 17B. He blinked once, then frowned slightly. "No," he said. "I'm comfortable where I am." "That seat is closer," the conductor said. "More leg room." The man considered this for a moment, then he shook his head. "I'd rather not." "Why?" The man opened his mouth to answer and paused. The silence stretched. "I don't know," he said finally, surprised by his own uncertainty. "It just doesn't feel necessary." Necessary. The word echoed. The conductor thanked him and moved on. That was when he understood. This was no longer about preference. The seat had ceased to register as a choice. The carriage continued its smooth progress through the night. Outside, darkness pressed close against the windows, broken only by the occasional distant signal that flashed briefly and vanished again. Inside, time behaved strangely. Minutes passed without wait. Passengers no longer checked their watches or phones. The rhythm of the train had replaced the need for measurement. The journey felt continuous rather than segmented, less a sequence of moments and more a single, extended state. The conductor felt it too. He glanced at his watch again and felt a brief flicker of disorientation. The numbers made sense, the schedule remained intact, and yet the sense of duration did not align with the display. He closed his watch and exhaled slowly. Seat 17B remained empty. A man in the back of the carriage spoke quietly, not intending to draw attention. "Has anyone sat there tonight?" The question drifted forward. A woman shook her head. "I don't think so." Another passenger frowned. "I thought it was empty when we boarded." "So did I." The conversation ended there, not because it reached a conclusion, but because it exhausted its relevance. No one felt compelled to pursue it further. The conductor felt a tightening in his chest. This was the moment when the question should have gained traction. It did not. Instead, the carriage absorbed it and moved on. He realized then that something more profound had occurred than the normalization of absence. Expectation itself had been rewritten. Passengers no longer felt that the seat should be filled. The idea that it ever might have been intended for someone had faded so completely that it no longer exerted pressure on their thinking. The conductor returned to his notebook one final time and opened it carefully. Seat 17B. The assignment was still there. But now, the name beside it felt accusatory, not because it was missing, but because it contradicted lived experience. The conductor understood something then that unsettled him deeply. Records depended on belief. They held authority only so long as reality continued to reference them. Once experience diverged far enough, records did not correct behavior. They became artifacts. He closed the notebook and slid it back into his pocket. The train continued onward. Passengers began to relax, not into sleep, but into acceptance. Their bodies eased. Their attention softened. The heightened awareness that had followed the station dissolved into a calm that bordered on indifference. Seat 17B remained empty, and now no one was guarding against that fact. The conductor looked down the aisle and felt the weight of the realization settle fully. An agreement had been made, not explicitly, not deliberately, but collectively. An agreement that the seat did not belong to this journey. And once that agreement existed, once it was shared without being spoken, it no longer mattered how it had formed. It only mattered that it held. The night express moved steadily through the night, its course unchanged, its systems functioning perfectly. Every passenger was present, every destination still waited, every rule still applied, except one. The rule that empty spaces must be explained. That rule had been quietly set aside, and as the carriage carried on through the darkness, the conductor understood, with a certainty that offered no comfort, that whatever came next would not announce itself loudly. It would arrive the same way this had, silently, accepted, and only noticed once it had already become normal. When arrival changed nothing. The first sign of the next major station was not light, but sound. The pitch of the rails shifted subtly beneath the carriage, a deeper resonance that carried through the floor and into the seats. It was a sound every frequent traveler recognized, the sound that announced interruption, arrival, a return to structure. Several passengers straightened without realizing they had done so. Hands moved to bags, jackets were adjusted. A few phones appeared, screens lighting briefly before being dimmed again. The habits of arrival reasserted themselves, automatic and reassuring. Seat 17B remained empty. The conductor entered the carriage ahead of the stop, his expression composed, his movements deliberate. "We'll be arriving shortly," he said. "Please remain seated until the train comes to a complete stop." His voice carried authority, but also restraint. He had learned over the past hours that authority did not always restore expectation. The train slowed gradually, its motion easing as the darkness outside gave way to ordered light. Platforms emerged, clean and symmetrical. Signs passed by, their names legible, precise. The night express slid into the station and stopped. Stillness followed. The doors opened with a soft release of air, and the outside world pressed in, cooler, brighter, unmistakably real. Footsteps echoed along the platform. Voices drifted through the open doors, detached from the carriage, belonging to lives untouched by what had occurred inside. Two station officials boarded with practiced calm. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions neutral. They carried tablets and checklists, tools designed to eliminate uncertainty. The conductor briefed them quietly, his voice low and controlled. One of the officials nodded and stepped forward. "Good evening," he said to the carriage. "We're conducting a brief verification. Thank you for your cooperation." The process began again. Tickets were scanned, names confirmed, seat numbers matched. The ritual unfolded smoothly, efficiently, almost soothing in its repetition. Everything aligned, until they reached seat 17B. The official paused, "This seat is unoccupied," he said, consulting his screen. "Yes," the conductor replied. "It has been throughout the journey." The official looked up. "Assigned?" "Yes." He frowned slightly and stepped closer to the seat. He examined it, not hurriedly, but thoroughly. Beneath the cushion, around the armrests, up at the luggage rack, along the aisle. "There's no obstruction," he said. "No restriction." "No," the conductor agreed. The official turned to the passengers. "Did anyone attempt to sit here?" "No one," he answered. Not because they were uncertain, because the question felt misplaced. A woman finally spoke, her tone careful. "I didn't consider it." The official blinked. "Why not?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know." He made a note. The second official leaned in. "Is there a missing passenger?" The conductor hesitated before answering. "There is a record of an assignment, but no one recalls boarding, and no one recalls expecting someone to be here." The officials exchanged a glance. "That's unusual," one said, "but not actionable," the other replied. They reviewed the data again, scrolling through entries, confirming times and counts. The system showed no error, no duplication, no omission it could recognize. The first official straightened. "From our perspective, there is no safety issue, no procedural violation." He gestured toward the seat. "An empty seat is not an incident." The words settled heavily in the carriage. Not an incident. The officials thanked the conductor and disembarked. The doors closed, the whistle sounded. The train began to move again. As the platform lights slid away and the darkness returned, something inside the carriage shifted, not sharply, but decisively. The second station had done what the first had done. It had looked directly at seat 17B and declared it irrelevant. Passengers felt it immediately, though none spoke. The last external opportunity for correction had passed. Authority had been consulted and had declined to intervene. The conductor returned to the front of the carriage and rested one hand lightly against a seat back. He felt tired in a way that sleep would not address. The train moved onward, its rhythm unbroken. Seat 17B remained empty, but now it carried a new weight. It was no longer simply accepted. It was validated. The station, solid, regulated, unquestionable, had confirmed that nothing was missing. The implication was unsettling. A man near the window spoke quietly. "So that's it?" No one answered. "What if it stays empty all the way?" another voice asked. A woman shrugged faintly. "Why wouldn't it?" The question landed softly, but it carried a truth that settled deeply. Why wouldn't it? No rule required the seat to be filled. No expectation demanded it. No system insisted on correction. The conductor realized then that arrival, the thing they had all trusted to restore clarity, had failed to do so because clarity depended on expectation, and expectation had already dissolved. He glanced once more at seat 17B. It looked smaller now, not physically but conceptually, as though its importance had collapsed inward, leaving behind a perfectly ordinary space that no longer demanded thought. Passengers relaxed again, more deeply this time. The heightened awareness that had followed earlier uncertainty faded. Conversation did not resume, but the tension did not return either. This calm was different. It was not uneasy. It was resigned. The conductor felt a quiet dread, not of danger, but of permanence. If the journey could absorb an empty seat so completely, then what else could it absorb? The train pressed on through the night, carrying its passengers toward destinations that still mattered, still waited. But inside the third carriage, something essential had been confirmed. Arrival had changed nothing. The system had seen the absence and dismissed it. And once absence no longer counted as loss, there was no reason to expect it would ever be reversed. Seat 17B remained empty as the night express continued into the darkness, no longer a question, no longer an anomaly, but a fact the journey had fully accepted. And that acceptance, more than anything else, signaled that whatever was happening had passed beyond the reach of correction. It had become part of the route itself. After the count was finished, once the second station fell behind them, the night express entered its longest, uninterrupted stretch of track. The countryside outside dissolved into a continuous black plain, broken only by the occasional distant signal that flared briefly and vanished. Inside the third carriage, the rhythm of the train settled into something deeper and steadier, as though it had found a pace it intended to keep for the rest of the night. Passengers relaxed, not into sleep exactly, but into a state of quiet acceptance. Shoulders lowered, hands loosened their grip on bags and armrests. The tension that had once sharpened awareness faded, replaced by the dull comfort of inevitability. Seat 17B remained empty, and now it no longer felt like something worth noticing. The conductor made one last slow pass through the carriage, more out of habit than necessity. He did not carry his notebook. He did not ask questions. He simply walked, eyes moving gently from face to face, seat to seat. Everything aligned, every passenger was present, every ticket accounted for, every destination still awaited. The absence had not disrupted the count. That, he realized, was the most unsettling part. Systems were built to detect loss, to register when something that should be present was not. But this absence had slipped through because it had never registered as loss at all. It had become neutral, acceptable, invisible. The conductor stopped briefly beside seat 17B. He did not touch it. He did not speak. He simply acknowledged it with the same quiet recognition one might offer a fixed feature of the carriage, like a pole or a window. Something structural, something that did not require engagement. He moved on. A woman seated nearby watched him go, then looked at the empty seat. For a moment she felt a faint sense of discomfort, quick and indistinct. Then it passed. She returned to her book. A man across the aisle leaned back and closed his eyes, listening to the steady hum beneath the floor. He thought briefly of how long they had been traveling, then let the thought dissolve. Time no longer felt relevant. The journey had become a continuous state, rather than a sequence of moments. Seat 17B did not intrude on that state. Later, someone stood to use the restroom. They stepped into the aisle, paused near the empty seat, then continued without hesitation. The pause was so brief it barely registered. No decision had been made. The seat simply had not been considered. The conductor returned to his position near the door between carriages and leaned lightly against the wall. He felt tired, not physically, but mentally, as though some part of his attention had been quietly disengaged without his consent. He tried once more to recall the name beside seat 17B. It no longer mattered that he couldn't. the name had lost its significance. It felt like a clerical artifact, ink that no longer pointed to reality. The record existed, but it no longer described anything that could be acted upon. The conductor realized something then, with a clarity that surprised him. The absence had survived every test it had been subjected to. It had passed inspection. It had passed verification. It had passed acknowledgement. And in doing so, it had earned the right to remain. Passengers began to gather their belongings slowly as the final destination approached. Bags were unzipped and zipped again. Coats were pulled on. Movements were unhurried, almost ceremonial. The carriage felt complete. That was the lie of it. Completeness did not require fullness, only coherence. And the journey had redefined coherence to include an empty seat that no one questioned. The conductor made a final announcement. "We'll be arriving shortly," he said. "Please ensure you have all personal belongings." Passengers nodded, murmured, complied. No one glanced at seat 17B. The train slowed. Lights outside grew brighter, more frequent. Buildings emerged from the darkness, their windows glowing softly. The final station awaited, orderly and indifferent. As the train eased into the platform and came to rest, the stillness felt final. Doors opened. Passengers stood and filed out, one by one. Each passed seat 17B without comment, without pause. It was simply part of the carriage, no more remarkable than the floor beneath their feet. Soon the carriage was empty. The conductor remained behind. He stood alone in the third carriage, the quiet now complete. Without passengers, the space felt smaller, more defined. The absence did not echo. Seat 17B sat exactly where it always had. Empty. The conductor walked to it slowly and looked down. For a brief moment, a thought surfaced, unbidden, unsettling. What if nothing had ever been meant to sit here? What if the record was wrong, not because it contained an error, but because it described an expectation that no longer applied? The thought did not frighten him. It simply settled. He straightened the armrest out of habit, then stopped himself. There was nothing to adjust. The seat was already in order. The conductor turned off the lights and stepped out onto the platform, closing the door behind him. The night express stood ready for its next journey, its systems intact, its carriage clean and neutral. Seat 17B would be available again. Or it would not. Either way, the journey would continue. And as the train prepared to move once more, one truth lingered quietly in the space between departure and arrival. Absence did not need to be dramatic to endure. Sometimes it only needed to be counted and found acceptable. Once that happened, it could remain indefinitely, unchallenged, unexplained, and perfectly still. The seat that became part of the route. The night express departed again before dawn. Fresh passengers boarded under pale station lights, moving with the quiet efficiency of people who trusted schedules more than stories. Tickets were scanned, bags were lifted, seats were claimed with little thought beyond comfort and convenience. Seat 17B remained empty. No one hesitated beside it. No one questioned it. No one noticed it at all. The conductor observed this from the doorway of the third carriage, his expression carefully neutral. He had not mentioned the seat to anyone. He no longer felt compelled to. The events of the night before had already passed into something quieter than memory, something closer to habit. The train found its rhythm once more. Outside, the landscape changed slowly from darkness to early light. Fields took shape. Roads appeared. The world resumed its ordinary clarity. Inside, the carriage felt complete. That was the unsettling part. Nothing about the space suggested loss. There was no sense of imbalance, no lingering tension. The passengers spoke softly, read, slept. Life unfolded as it always did. Seat 17B blended seamlessly into the pattern. The conductor walked down the aisle and began his routine. Tickets were checked, numbers matched, names were confirmed. Every passenger was accounted for. When he reached the row containing the empty seat, he did not pause. He marked his list and moved on. The action startled him, not because it was wrong, but because it felt natural. Later, during a brief lull, he returned to the carriage and stood near the seat once more. He looked at it carefully, searching for the sensation that had once accompanied its emptiness. There was none. The seat no longer felt charged or unsettled. It did not draw attention. It did not resist it. It simply existed. The conductor realized then that something subtle but decisive had occurred. The seat had crossed a threshold. It was no longer an anomaly that demanded explanation. It had become part of the route, like a curve in the track or a station that no longer stopped receiving passengers at night. Something known only by those who worked the line long enough to stop questioning it. He recalled other things like that, signals that were never used but never removed, doors that no one opened but no one sealed, rules that existed in writing but not in practice. Seat 17B had joined them. The train continued through the morning, making its scheduled stops. Passengers disembarked and boarded. The carriage emptied and filled again. Seat 17B remained untouched. At one stop, a woman paused beside it briefly, glancing down as if considering the seat. For a moment, the conductor felt a tightening in his chest. Then she shifted her bag to the other side and walked on. No thought followed. The moment passed. The conductor felt something ease inside him, not relief exactly, but resignation. He understood now that the journey had not taken anything away. It had redefined what mattered. The original expectation that the seat should be occupied had dissolved so thoroughly that it no longer exerted pressure on reality. The record still existed somewhere, archived and inert, but it had lost its authority. Reality had chosen a different configuration, and reality, once established, did not require justification. Near midday, the conductor sat briefly in the staff compartment, sipping coffee and watching the countryside pass. He thought about the name that had once been attached to seat 17B. He could not recall it. That, too, no longer troubled him. Names were for people who arrived, for passengers who completed journeys, for presences that asserted themselves. Whatever expectation had once belonged to that seat had not arrived, and without arrival, there was nothing to remember. The train slowed for another station. People stood, gathered their belongings, and stepped off. Seat 17B remained empty, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been absorbed. By the time the night express reached the end of its route, the third carriage looked exactly as it always had, orderly, symmetrical, complete. No one asked questions. No reports were filed. No corrections were made. The conductor closed the doors and prepared the train for its return journey. As he walked down the aisle, one final time he paused, not beside seat 17B, but a few rows ahead of it. He looked back briefly, then forward again. The seat did not demand his attention. That was its final transformation. What had once unsettled him now required no effort at all to accept. The night express departed again, carrying new passengers into the quiet spaces between destinations. Seat 17B remained part of the carriage, empty, unremarkable, permanent. And somewhere along the line, without alarm, without loss, without resistance, the journey had proven something quietly profound, that absence does not always arrive as disappearance. Sometimes it arrives as something that never insists on being present in the first place. And once the world adjusts to that idea, nothing feels missing at all. Some mysteries are loud. They leave behind alarms, questions, and unfinished reports. Others end quietly. The night express kept running. Passengers came and went. Seats were counted. Destinations were reached. And seat 17B remained exactly where it was. Empty. Ordinary. Accepted. No one searched for what never arrived. No one mourned what was never noticed. The journey adjusted, and then forgot there had ever been anything to question. Perhaps that is how the most unsettling absences endure, not by taking something away, but by teaching us to stop expecting it. So the next time you travel at night, and you choose a seat without thinking, pause for a moment. Notice the spaces no one claims, the gaps that feel normal, the absences that don't ask to be explained. Because sometimes the mystery isn't what disappears, it's what never needed to appear at all.